Prime Field.
How does a team win 24 games, crush preseason expectations, make the NCAA Tournament, and somehow leave March looking like it got sent into a trap? Because that is exactly why Felisha Legette-Jack's post-game comments hit so hard. This was not just Syracuse losing. This was Syracuse getting obliterated, then their head coach turning the conversation away from the scoreboard and straight toward the bracket itself. Not the refs, not the players, not execution. The bracket. And when Legette-Jack used language like personal attack and called the repeated draw unacceptable, she instantly created the hottest women's college basketball debate of the week. Was she exposing a broken system? Or was she just reacting to one of the ugliest losses of the tournament? That is the question, because the deeper you look, the messier this gets. First, let's deal with the part nobody in Syracuse wants to relive. UConn beat Syracuse 98-45. That is a 53-point loss. And not just any 53-point loss. It was the worst NCAA tournament defeat in Syracuse women's basketball history. Syracuse came into this game at 24, 9 after finishing 12, 6 in the ACC, and tying for 5th in the conference, even though they were picked 13th in the preseason. So this was a team that had massively outperformed expectations. They were not supposed to be here this fast, but they got here anyway. Then they ran into 36 and 0 UConn, the number 1 overall seed, and everything fell apart. The game turned into a nightmare during a first-half 31-0 UConn run. Syracuse went more than 10 consecutive minutes without scoring. By halftime, it was 65-12. That halftime number alone tells the story. It was Syracuse's worst first half ever, while UConn put up the second most first-half points in program history. That is not just domination, that is total control. And when a tournament game looks that lopsided, people usually stop asking structural questions and just say one thing: your team got exposed. But this story did not end with the score, and it actually started there. The most brutal part of this matchup was not just that Syracuse lost, it was how they lost. This team built its identity on physicality, second chances, and rebounding. Syracuse had branded itself Rebounding University, and the stats backed it up. The Orange ranked second in the nation in offensive rebounds per game at 18.6. That is supposed to be their superpower. Against UConn, it disappeared. The Huskies out-rebounded Syracuse 46-28. That is an 18-board gap against the exact thing Syracuse prides itself on most, and it got worse. Syracuse shot 1 for 18 from 3. That is 5.6%. UConn shot 13 for 26 from deep, 50%. So one team could not buy a basket, and the other team looked like it was in a shooting drill. Then came the turnovers. Syracuse committed 20 of them. UConn turned those into 35 points. Syracuse only got 10 points off turnovers the other way. The bench scoring, UConn won that too, 36-15. Everywhere Syracuse usually finds stability, UConn ripped it away. That is why this loss felt bigger than one bad night. It looked like Syracuse's entire identity got neutralized by a team operating at a completely different level. And when a blowout becomes this extreme, there is usually a star performance sitting right in the middle of it. For UConn, that was Azzi Fudd. Fudd dropped a career-high 34 points and hit 8 threes. 8. So while Syracuse was trying to survive, Fudd was basically delivering the tactical engine of the entire collapse. Every time Syracuse needed a response, UConn had another answer, and Fudd was often the one providing it. That is what makes this debate so uncomfortable for Syracuse fans, because there's a version of the story where the committee created a brutal draw, and there's also a version where Syracuse simply ran into one of the best individual performances of the tournament. On the other side, Syracuse freshman center Uche Azzi still managed 12 points and 6 rebounds. That matters, because Azzi was not just any freshman. She was the ACC Rookie of the Year and an All-ACC first-team selection. She represents the future of the program. But even that respectable line felt tiny compared to what UConn unleashed. And there is one more detail that makes this game even more surreal. It happened on Gino Auriemma's birthday. Auriemma is reportedly 13-1 on that date. So from UConn's perspective, this looked like another celebration in a dynasty that never really stops rolling. From Syracuse's perspective, it felt like they were delivered to the party as the sacrifice. Here's why this controversy exploded. Legette-Jack did not just say UConn was better. She aimed at the NCAA Selection Committee. Syracuse was identified as the 36th overall seed, while Princeton was 34th. Because both schools were located within roughly a 4-hour drive of Storrs, Connecticut, the committee's proximity rules placed them in the UConn pod. That means Syracuse did not get a neutral setting. They got a road game against the undefeated number 1 overall seed on that team's home floor. And that is the foundation of the personal attack claim. Not that the NCAA literally targeted Syracuse out of spite, but that the system keeps creating the same outcome over and over, and eventually it starts to feel personal even if it is technically procedural. This is what makes the story bigger than one coach venting after a bad loss. Legette-Jack is arguing that the women's tournament still has a structural setup that can punish rising teams in the name of geography, convenience, ticket sales, and fan accessibility. In other words, Syracuse did not just lose to UConn. Syracuse got sent into the Storrs Trap. And this is the part that stops this from sounding like simple sour grapes. Legette-Jack's complaint is not based on one matchup. It is based on a pattern. According to the research, Syracuse has faced UConn in 5 of its last 7 NCAA tournament appearances. Those years were 2016, 2017, 2021, 2024, and now 2026. Read that again. 5 times in 7 tournament trips, Syracuse ends up staring at the same giant, and 3 of those meetings happened on UConn's home court. That is why the phrase personal attack landed so hard. Not because it was literally true, but because it captured how absurd the repetition feels from Syracuse's side. And there is even more history here. Back in 2019, Legette-Jack's Buffalo team also lost to UConn in the second round in Storrs. So this is not just Syracuse frustration, this is years of accumulated experience from a coach who has spent 37 years in the business and, according to the research, had never really made comments like this before. That matters, because when a veteran coach with nearly 4 decades of experience finally snaps publicly, people listen differently. Now it stops sounding like an excuse. Now it sounds like a breaking point. This is why this story has real viral energy. There are receipts on both sides. If you're defending UConn, the argument is easy. The Huskies are 36-0. They are the number 1 overall seed. They just made their 32nd straight Sweet 16. They were statistically built for a championship run. Syracuse got overwhelmed because UConn overwhelms people. End of story. And honestly, that argument is strong. But the other side has numbers too. Syracuse was not some fake Cinderella. They finished 24-9, tied for 5th in the ACC after being picked 13th, and built one of the most distinctive rebounding identities in the country. Advanced metric context had them around the national top 40 range. Then the bracket put that team on a collision course with the single worst possible opponent in the single worst possible environment because of proximity logic. That is not imaginary. That is how the system works. So both things can be true. UConn was absolutely good enough to crush Syracuse, and the bracket may still have created an unfair path by feeding a rising program directly into a home court buzzsaw. Legette-Jack reportedly even suggested she would have accepted a lower seed if it meant avoiding that exact draw. Think about how crazy that sounds. A coach would rather be seeded worse than walk back into the same trap again. That tells you this is not just post-game emotion. It is a protest against the structure itself. This is where the story becomes bigger than Syracuse and UConn. If women's college basketball keeps growing, should the bracket still be shaped this heavily by geography and crowd convenience? Because the proximity rule might be efficient, but it can also create a glass ceiling for programs trying to climb. If a team like Syracuse keeps getting pushed into the same regional monster because it happens to live in the wrong place, then fans are going to ask whether parity is real or just a talking point. That is the nerve Legette-Jack hit. Not just that Syracuse got embarrassed, but that the system may be helping create these embarrassments for the same kinds of teams over and over. And when you combine that structural argument with a 98, 45 final score, a 31, 0 run, a 65, 12 halftime deficit, a career-high 34 points from Azzi Fudd, and a coach saying personal attack, you get exactly the kind of story that explodes online. Because now everybody has a lane into the conversation. UConn fans hear greatness, Syracuse fans hear injustice, neutral fans hear controversy, and the sport gets a question it cannot dodge forever. Was this just March Madness doing what March Madness does? Or did Felisha Legette-Jack finally say out loud what smaller programs have been feeling for years? The truth is, this story works because it refuses to stay simple. UConn looked like a machine. Syracuse looked overwhelmed. But the road that led Syracuse into that building deserves just as much attention as what happened once the game started. 5 matchups and 7 tournament appearances is not normal. 3 meetings on UConn's home court is not normal. A coach with 37 years in the business finally going public like this is not normal. So whether you think Felisha Legette-Jack was exposing a flawed system or making excuses after a humiliation, one thing is clear. She turned a brutal loss into a bracket debate that the sport can no longer ignore, and that may end up mattering almost as much as the game itself. So now it is your turn. Was Felisha Legette-Jack right to call this out, or was this just what happens when a good team runs into a great one? Comment your take. Subscribe for more women's college hoops breakdowns, and share this with the friend who always says the bracket is never as fair as it looks. Fact base used from your attached research includes Syracuse 24, 9-12, 6 ACC after being picked 13th, UConn 36-0 and number 1 overall seed, 98-45 final score, 31-0 first half run, Syracuse scoreless for over 10 minutes, 65-12 halftime, Syracuse 1 of 18 from 3, and UConn 13 of 26. Rebounding margin 46-28 UConn. 20 Syracuse turnovers leading to 35 UConn points. Bench scoring 36. 15 UConn. Uche Zoje's ACC honors and 12 points, 6 rebounds. Azzi Fudd's career high 34 points and 8 threes. Gino Auriemma birthday angle. Syracuse's 36th overall seed and Princeton 34th. Proximity rule placing both in Storrs. Syracuse drawing UConn in 5 of 7 tournament appearances. Buffalo's 2019 loss to UConn and Storrs. Legette-Jack's 37 years in coaching.
Prime Field.